The alarm started before I had even finished my coffee. I am Vexthara Ilnor, and on that morning I was the ranking defense officer of the Ilvanar cluster, sitting in a command chair that suddenly felt too small for what was coming. The screen in front of me showed 7 enemy signatures crossing the outer marker of our system, and my hands went cold before my mind caught up with what my eyes were telling me. 7 ships, then 12. Then, within the hour, more than I could count on the display without the numbers blurring together. 3 weeks earlier, the Galactic Council had voted to withdraw every Allied fleet from our region. I remember the exact words the counselor used, because I have replayed them in my head more times than I want to admit. He said the risk of a wider war was not proportional to the value of our systems. He said it as if he were reading a grocery list, not signing away the lives of 9 billion people who lived across our worlds. I was in the command hall when the final transmission arrived. It was short, polite, almost gentle, in the way that a closing door can be gentle right before it locks. The screen showed the counselor's calm face, his voice steady and rehearsed, telling us that the coalition fleets were being reassigned to protect systems of, and I quote, greater strategic value. He wished us resilience. Then the connection ended, and that was the last we ever heard from the people who had once called us allies. I watched the ships leave orbit that same day. Dozens of warships that had been stationed above our capital for 6 years, ships I had trained alongside, ships whose captains I had shared meals with, all of them turning away in formation and vanishing into the dark without so much as a final message to the people they left behind. I stood on the observation deck of my own vessel and watched their engine trails fade, and I understood, in a way I had never understood before, what it meant to be truly alone. My name might not mean much to you. My species is small, our worlds few, and our fleet was never meant to fight a war on our own. We are the kind of people the galaxy forgets exists until we are gone. But I am telling you this story because I was there when everything changed, and because someone needs to remember it the way it actually happened, not the way it gets told in speeches later. The empire that came for us called itself the Drovnar Ascendancy. I will not waste your time describing their politics or their history, because in the end, none of that mattered. What mattered was that they wanted our systems, our resources, and the strategic position our cluster held at the edge of 3 major trade lanes. And now that the Council had pulled away every fleet that might have stopped them, we were exactly what they wanted us to be, an easy target. I had 11 ships under my command, 11, against a force that grew larger every hour on my display. My oldest ship was older than I was. My newest ship had a hull crack in the aft section that our engineers had patched with material never designed for that purpose, because we no longer had access to proper supply lines. We were not a fleet. We were a memory of one. I gave the order to move into defensive formation anyway, because there was nothing else to do. Behind us was Ilvanar Prime, our capital world, home to almost 2 billion people who had nowhere else to go. There was no evacuation plan because there had never been enough ships to evacuate anyone, and there was no fallback position because we were already standing on the only ground we had left. I remember speaking to my crew before the first wave arrived. I did not give them false hope. I told them the truth, because I believed they deserved it. I said that we were likely going to lose this fight, that the odds were not in our favor, and that if any of them wanted to record a final message for their families, now was the time. Nobody left the bridge. Every single one of them stayed at their post, and I have never in my life been more proud of anyone. The first wave hit us 4 hours later. I will not describe every detail of that battle, because some things are better left as feelings rather than pictures. I will tell you that we fought harder than 11 ships should have been able to fight. I will tell you that we lost 3 of them within the first 20 minutes, and that every voice that went silent on the comm channel stayed with me long after the battle ended. I will tell you that I gave orders I never wanted to give, and that I would give them again if it meant buying even 1 more hour for the people on the surface below us. By the time the enemy pulled back to regroup, rather than press their advantage all at once, we had 6 ships left. 6 ships, and a capital world that had no idea how close it had come to losing everything in a single afternoon. I sat in my command chair afterward, staring at the tactical display, trying to calculate how long we could hold. The number I kept arriving at was not comforting. 2 days, maybe 3, if the enemy attacked with patience rather than overwhelming force all at once. I did not believe patience was something they were known for. It was my communications officer, a steady young man named Ron Kell, who brought me the idea that changed everything, though neither of us understood that at the time. He suggested we send a distress signal on every open frequency we had access to, not just through council channels, but through every old, unused, half-forgotten relay in our system. He said it was unlikely anyone would hear it. He said it was probably a waste of power we could not afford to waste. I told him to send it anyway. What did we have to lose that we were not already about to lose? We broadcast that signal into the dark, not really expecting an answer, the way you might call out into an empty room, just to hear your own voice one more time before the lights go out. I did not think about who might be listening on the other end. I did not think about the species the Council had spent decades dismissing, ignoring, treating as too young, too unpredictable, too unrefined to be worth inviting into galactic society. I did not think about humanity at all. That is the part of this story that still makes me feel foolish when I look back on it. None of us thought about them, not once. They were a footnote in Council records, a species with impressive industrial output and a reputation for stubbornness that other species found faintly amusing. Nobody in that command hall, myself included, imagined that the signal we sent out of pure desperation would end up in the hands of the one species with no obligation to answer it at all. We spent the next day preparing for what we assumed would be our final stand. My engineers worked without rest, pulling spare parts from decommissioned systems to patch the damage our remaining ships had taken. My crews slept in shifts on the bridge because there was no time to return to their quarters. I walked the length of my ship more than once that day, speaking with anyone who wanted to speak with me, because I understood that for some of them, it might be the last conversation they ever had. I remember standing at a viewport late in that long, quiet day, watching the stars, and thinking about how strange it was that a galaxy this vast could feel so completely empty when you needed it most. I had grown up being told that the Coalition stood for unity, for shared protection, for the idea that no member world would ever be left to face annihilation alone. I had believed that. I think, in some quiet corner of myself, I still wanted to believe it, even as the evidence in front of me said otherwise. The enemy fleet began its final approach the following morning. I gave the order to launch every remaining fighter craft we had. I gave the order to bring every weapon system online, even the ones our engineers had warned might fail under sustained use. I stood at the center of my bridge, watching the enemy formation grow larger on the display, and I prepared myself, as best as anyone can prepare themselves, for the end of everything I had spent my life protecting. And then, just as the first enemy ships crossed into weapons range, my sensor officer called out something that made no sense to me at all. She said there were unidentified gravitic disturbances forming at the edge of the system. Not enemy signatures, not anything in our database. Something else entirely. Something arriving with a kind of raw, violent energy that our instruments struggled to even properly measure. I remember looking at that display and feeling something shift inside my chest. Something between fear and a desperate, fragile hope I did not dare to name yet. Whatever was coming, it was coming fast, and it was coming directly toward us. I had no idea, in that moment, that I was about to witness the arrival of a fleet that would change everything I understood about war, about courage, and about what it means for someone to choose to fight for people who never asked them to. I want to go back, before I tell you what happened next, and explain something the Council never bothered to explain to anyone, including themselves. There was a species out at the edge of known space that the Coalition had chosen, decades ago, to leave outside the circle of galactic society. I had heard of them the way most people in the coalition had heard of them, through brief mentions in strategic reports and the occasional dismissive comment at diplomatic gatherings. Humans, a species from a single world called Earth, technologically capable, fiercely independent, and by every account the Council had ever produced, simply not ready. Not ready for what, exactly? Nobody had ever explained to my satisfaction. I remember asking a Council liaison once, years earlier, why humanity had never been formally invited into the coalition, despite meeting every stated requirement for membership. She had given me a long, careful answer about cultural readiness and diplomatic stability, an answer that sounded thoughtful on the surface and meant absolutely nothing underneath it. The truth, I have come to believe, is simpler and less flattering to the Council than any official explanation. Humans made people uncomfortable. They asked too many direct questions. They did not follow the slow, careful, endlessly patient customs that governed every other interaction within coalition space. They were, in the eyes of the people who ran the galaxy, inconvenient. So the Council left them alone, not as an enemy, not as a threat, simply as something to be managed from a distance, observed quietly, and never quite let in. I confess that I never gave humanity much thought before that day. They existed somewhere out past the edges of our maps, a curiosity rather than a concern, a species other officers occasionally joked about during long shifts on the bridge. I had heard stories, the kind that get exaggerated with each retelling, about human ships that ignored standard engagement protocols, about human commanders who made decisions no properly trained coalition officer would ever consider making. I had assumed, as most of us did, that these stories were simply that, stories. I did not know, sitting in my command chair with an enemy fleet bearing down on my system, that one of Earth's listening posts, a small, half-forgotten monitoring station near the edge of their own territory, happened to be tuned to exactly the kind of old, obscure frequency that Doran Kell had chosen for our distress signal. I did not know that a message meant as a final, desperate act of hope had traveled further than any of us imagined it could, and had landed in the hands of people who owed us absolutely nothing. I learned the details of what happened on their end, much later, from a young human officer who told me the story over a shared meal, weeks after everything had settled. She told me that the message had been picked up by a communications technician working a quiet overnight shift, someone who almost dismissed it as background noise before realizing it carried the unmistakable structure of a distress call. She told me the technician had flagged it, and that within hours, the message had made its way up through several layers of command, each person along the way understanding, with growing clarity, exactly what they were looking at. A dying system, a species with no allies left, a call for help sent into the dark, with no real expectation that anyone would answer. I asked her what happened when that message reached the people who could actually do something about it. She smiled, in the particular way I would later learn humans smile when they are about to tell you something that makes them quietly proud. She said there had been no lengthy debate, no committee formed to weigh the diplomatic implications, no careful calculation of whether helping strangers who had never once acknowledged their existence was worth the cost. She said someone in a position of authority looked at the message, looked at the coordinates, and gave an order to move. I did not understand, at the time she told me this, how remarkable that was. I came from a culture, from an entire galactic system of cultures, where every major decision passed through layers of consultation, precedent, and careful political calculation before anything happened. The idea that a fleet could simply be sent, without months of preparation, without endless meetings, without anyone first determining what benefit might come from the effort, was almost impossible for me to fully grasp. But that is exactly what happened. While my crews were bracing for what we believed would be our final battle, a human fleet was already crossing vast stretches of space, moving with a kind of urgency that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the simple fact that people were in danger and help was available. I think about that decision often, even now. I think about how different our own history might have looked if the Council had ever been capable of that kind of immediate, uncomplicated choice. Help people because they need help. Not because it serves a broader strategic goal, not because it strengthens a political position, simply because it is the right thing to do, and because waiting costs lives that cannot be recovered later. Back in my system, none of us understood any of this yet. All we knew was that something enormous was approaching, moving faster than any coalition vessel I had ever tracked, and closing the distance to our position with an intensity that made my sensor officer's voice shake slightly as she read out the numbers. I remember the tension on my bridge in those final minutes before the unknown fleet arrived. Nobody spoke unless they had to. Every eye was fixed on the display, watching those gravitic disturbances grow sharper, more defined, more clearly organized into something that could only be a fleet formation. I remember thinking, with a kind of numb, exhausted dread, that perhaps the Drovnar ascendancy had called in reinforcements of their own, and that whatever chance we had of surviving even a few more hours was about to disappear entirely. I gave the order to prepare for the worst. I told my crew to hold formation, to keep every weapon system active, to be ready for anything. I did not know what else to say. I had run out of strategies hours earlier. All that remained was the discipline of simply continuing to fight for as long as we were able. And then the unknown fleet crossed into visual range, and every assumption I had about what was coming fell apart at once. They did not look like coalition ships. They did not move like coalition ships either. Where our vessels, and even the enemy's vessels, tended toward smooth, elegant hull designs built as much for appearance as function, these new ships were blunt, heavy, and unmistakably built for one purpose only: endurance. They looked less like diplomatic instruments and more like something forged specifically to survive punishment that would destroy anything else. I counted the signatures as they resolved on my display. Not a small scouting force. A full battle fleet, arriving with a coordination and speed that suggested they had crossed a significant distance in a remarkably short amount of time, pushing their systems in ways that our own engineers would have considered reckless beyond reason. My tactical officer, a calm and normally unshakable woman named Sira Nell, turned to me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. She said the incoming fleet was broadcasting an identification signal and that the signal was human. I remember the silence that followed those words. Nobody on my bridge moved, nobody spoke. I think, in that moment, every one of us was trying to reconcile the stories we had heard about this distant, dismissed species with the sheer, overwhelming reality of what was now bearing down on our position with obvious and immediate intent. I opened a channel because I did not know what else to do, and because some instinct told me that whatever was about to happen, I needed to understand it as clearly as I could. The face that appeared on my screen belonged to a woman who looked younger than I expected, though something in her eyes suggested she had already seen enough conflict to age far beyond her years. Her uniform was simple, functional, nothing like the elaborate ceremonial markings coalition officers wore, even in the middle of combat. She introduced herself as Fleet Commander Grace Whitfield, and her voice carried none of the careful diplomatic phrasing I had spent my entire career learning to use in exactly this kind of situation. She said, and I remember these words exactly because I have thought about them so many times since, that she had received our distress call, that her fleet was there to help, and that she needed my tactical data immediately so her ships could integrate with our defensive formation without wasting time on unnecessary introductions. I sat there for a moment, stunned into silence, trying to process the fact that a fleet commander from a species with no formal alliance with us, no treaty obligation, no political incentive whatsoever, was asking me for tactical data with the same brisk efficiency I would expect from a long-standing ally rather than a stranger who had crossed unimaginable distances on nothing more than a garbled distress signal and her own judgment. I asked her because I could not stop myself from asking why she had come, why any of them had come. We had no formal relationship with humanity. We had never once reached out to them, never once advocated for their inclusion in coalition affairs, never once treated them as anything other than a footnote in a much larger galactic story. She looked at me through the screen, and her expression shifted into something quiet and direct, something that felt more honest than any answer I had ever received from a council official in my entire career. She said that they had heard people were dying and that they had ships capable of helping. She said that was reason enough. I did not have a response prepared for an answer that simple. I had spent my whole life inside a system where every action required justification, precedent, and careful political calculation. Here was someone telling me, without hesitation, that the mere existence of suffering was sufficient reason to act, and that no further explanation was necessary or expected. Behind her, on the same channel, I could see the bridge of her ship coming to life, with rapid, purposeful activity. Officers moving with clear urgency, weapon systems arming, formation data already being relayed to the rest of her fleet without any delay for further discussion. There was no debate happening on that bridge. There was only action. I gave the order to share our tactical data immediately. Whatever questions I still had about who these people were and why they had truly come, I understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that we no longer had the luxury of hesitation. The enemy fleet was still out there, still preparing for what would likely be their final assault, and for the first time since the Council abandoned us, we were no longer facing that assault alone. Commander Whitfield's voice came through the channel one final time before the connection closed, her tone shifting into something sharper, more focused, the voice of someone who had clearly done this before and intended to do it again as many times as necessary. She told me to hold formation, to trust her fleet to cover our flanks, and to prepare for a fight unlike anything my crews had likely experienced before. I looked around my bridge, at the exhausted, frightened, determined faces of the crew who had stayed with me through everything, and I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel since the Council's final transmission all those weeks ago. I felt hope. Real, tangible hope, arriving in the form of warships that had no reason to be there at all, sent by a species the galaxy had spent decades pretending did not matter. I did not yet know how these humans fought, or what it would mean to stand beside them in the battle that was about to begin. I only knew that for the first time since this nightmare started, we were no longer alone, and that fact alone was enough to steady my hands as I turned back to my display and prepared for what was coming. The enemy fleet resumed its advance within the hour, and I watched Commander Whitfield's ships move into position with a kind of coordinated aggression that unsettled me even as it filled me with a fragile, cautious relief. Coalition doctrine, the doctrine I had trained under for my entire career, taught careful formation discipline above almost everything else. Ships held their assigned positions. Commanders calculated acceptable losses before engaging, weighing the value of every vessel against the strategic benefit of every maneuver. It was a philosophy built on precision, patience, and a deep, almost sacred respect for the cost of every life placed in danger. What I witnessed from the human fleet in the opening minutes of that battle followed none of those principles, and yet somehow proved more effective than anything I had ever seen from a coalition command structure. Commander Whitfield did not wait for the enemy to establish a clear attack pattern before committing her forces. The moment the Drovnar vanguard crossed into range, her ships surged forward without hesitation, breaking from any recognizable formation and instead adapting, in real time, to the specific weaknesses each enemy vessel presented. I watched two of her cruisers abandon their assigned positions entirely, moving to flank an enemy destroyer that had drifted slightly out of formation, exploiting the gap before the enemy commander had even finished registering the threat. I asked Sierra Nell, my tactical officer, how she would classify what we were watching. She stared at the display for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a kind of stunned respect I had never heard from her before. She said it looked less like a battle plan and more like a series of decisions being made and remade every few seconds, each one responding directly to whatever the enemy had just done, rather than following any predetermined structure at all. I understood, watching that display, something about humanity that no council report had ever managed to explain to me. They had never been given the chance to sit at the same table as the rest of the galaxy, never been taught the slow, careful, endlessly cautious rules that governed how every other coalition species approached conflict. They had developed their own doctrine in isolation, shaped entirely by their own history, their own instincts, their own understanding of what it meant to fight for survival. And that isolation, that very thing the Council had used as justification for excluding them, had produced a fighting style unlike anything the Drovnar Ascendancy had ever encountered. I saw it most clearly about 20 minutes into the engagement, when one of the human destroyers took catastrophic damage to its primary power core. Under Coalition doctrine, that ship would have immediately retreated, prioritizing crew survival over any further tactical contribution, and no commander would have questioned that decision. Instead, I watched that same crippled destroyer continue firing every remaining weapon system it had, driving directly into the heart of an enemy formation, drawing fire away from two smaller human vessels that were repositioning to support our remaining ships. I asked Commander Whitfield about it later, once the battle had settled into something resembling a lull, my voice carrying more emotion than I intended when I questioned why she had allowed that crew to continue fighting rather than ordering an immediate retreat. She told me, with a calm that startled me, that the crew had made that choice themselves. She said human commanders trusted their people to understand the stakes of a battle better than anyone giving orders from a command chair 3 systems away, and that when a crew chose to hold their position to protect others, that choice deserved to be honored rather than overridden. I did not know, in that moment, whether to be horrified or humbled by that answer. Every part of my training told me that commanders existed precisely to make those calculations for their crews, to weigh acceptable losses with clear, unemotional precision. But watching the results of her doctrine unfold across my display, watching enemy ship after enemy ship struggle to predict an opponent who refused to follow any pattern a coalition tactical database could recognize, I began to understand that perhaps precision was not always the advantage I had spent my career believing it to be. The battle stretched on for hours, longer than any single engagement I had experienced in this entire conflict. The Drovnar commander, whoever they were, clearly struggled to adjust to an opponent who calculated risk on entirely different terms than anything their own doctrine had prepared them for. I watched enemy formations hesitate, at moments when hesitation proved fatal, watched their commanders second-guess maneuvers that would have worked perfectly against a coalition fleet, but failed completely against ships willing to commit fully to positions that any properly trained officer would have considered reckless. At one point during the engagement, I found myself coordinating directly with a human officer aboard one of their support cruisers, a steady, quick-thinking man named Nathan Cole who had been assigned to manage communications between our combined fleets. I asked him, during a brief pause in the fighting, how his people had developed a fighting style so completely different from everything I had studied throughout my career. He told me something I have carried with me ever since. He said that when you grow up without anyone else looking out for you, you learn very quickly that hesitation costs more than commitment ever does. He said humanity had spent generations solving their own problems without outside help, and that this history had taught them to trust decisive action over careful calculation, because careful calculation, in their experience, often arrived too late to matter. I thought about the council in that moment, about the endless meetings and careful deliberations that had ultimately produced nothing but a polite, well-worded message informing us that our lives were not considered a priority. I thought about how much time we had lost, across the entire history of the coalition, to caution disguised as wisdom. The turning point of the battle came roughly 6 hours into the engagement, when the Drovnar commander finally attempted a full-scale assault, committing their entire remaining force in a single coordinated strike aimed directly at Ilvanar Prime. I remember the moment that decision became clear on our tactical display, the sudden shift in enemy formation, every remaining ship converging toward the same trajectory, aimed straight at the world I had sworn to protect. I gave the order to intercept immediately, and my remaining ships surged forward alongside the human fleet, but I understood, watching the numbers on my display, that even combined, our forces were still significantly outnumbered by what the enemy had just committed. It was Commander Whitfield who made the decision that ultimately broke the assault, a decision I would later learn her own officers had questioned in the moment, though none of them hesitated to follow through once she gave the order. Rather than meeting the enemy assault head-on, matching force against force in the kind of direct confrontation coalition doctrine would have demanded, she ordered her fleet to split, sending half her ships in a wide arc around the enemy formation, while the remaining half, along with what was left of my own fleet, held the direct line of defense. I did not understand the purpose of that maneuver until it was already unfolding, until I watched the human ships that had circled wide suddenly emerge directly behind the enemy formation, catching them in a crossfire they had no way of anticipating and no time to properly defend against. The Drovnar formation, so committed to their forward assault, found themselves suddenly fighting on two fronts at once, their carefully coordinated attack collapsing into confusion within minutes. I watched enemy ship after enemy ship break formation, some attempting to retreat, others simply overwhelmed by an attack pattern their doctrine had never prepared them to face. I remember the moment the enemy commander finally gave the order to withdraw, watching their remaining ships pull back from the system in a retreat that looked nothing like the disciplined, orderly formation they had arrived with. It was chaotic, desperate, and utterly unlike anything I had witnessed from the Drovnar ascendancy throughout this entire campaign. My bridge erupted into something I had not heard in weeks: relief. Genuine, unguarded relief, expressed in a dozen different voices all speaking at once, some of them close to tears, others simply staring at the display in stunned silence as the enemy signatures finally began to fade from our sensors. I sat in my command chair, watching the last of the Drovnar fleet retreat beyond our system's edge, and I found myself unable to fully process what had just happened. 3 days earlier, I had been preparing my crew for what I believed would be our final battle. Now I was watching an enemy fleet flee from a system they had come to conquer, driven back by ships that belonged to a people who had no obligation to help us at all. Commander Whitfield's voice came through my channel once the last enemy signature disappeared from our sensors, and I remember the exhaustion in her tone, the kind of tiredness that comes from hours of sustained focus rather than physical exertion alone. She asked about our casualties, our remaining ship status, whether we required any immediate medical support for our crews. I told her the truth, that we had lost 3 ships in the initial engagement before her fleet arrived, but that every remaining ship under my command had survived the battle that followed. I told her that I did not know how to properly express what her people had done for us, that no words I had available in my own language felt adequate to the moment. She was quiet for a moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the formality I had expected from someone in her position. She simply said that she was glad they had arrived in time, and that she hoped it made a difference for the people still living on the world below us. I looked at the display showing Ilvanar Prime, still intact, still safe, still home to nearly 2 billion people who had no idea how close they had come to losing everything. And I understood that this single sentence, spoken so simply by someone who had crossed unimaginable distances to help strangers, carried more weight than every carefully worded diplomatic statement I had heard from the Council in my entire career. I did not know, in that quiet moment after the battle, what would come next. I did not know how the wider galaxy would react to what had just happened, or how the Council would attempt to explain their own absence once word of this battle spread. I only knew that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the tactical balance of this particular conflict, but in my own understanding of what alliance, and courage, and simple human decency could actually mean when everything else had failed. The days following the battle passed in a strange, quiet blur that I struggled to fully process even as I lived through it. Ilvanar Prime, for the first time in weeks, experienced something close to normal life. Repair crews worked around the clock on our damaged ships. Human engineers standing shoulder to shoulder with our own technicians, sharing knowledge and equipment with an openness that surprised me every time I witnessed it. There was no hesitation in their assistance, no calculation of what benefit they might gain from helping us rebuild. They simply worked, because there was work that needed doing, and because they had already decided, apparently without much internal debate at all, that helping us fully recover mattered as much as helping us survive the initial battle. I spent much of that first week in meetings with Commander Whitfield, coordinating the ongoing defense of our system in case the Drovnar Ascendancy attempted a second assault once they had regrouped. It was during those meetings that I began to understand more fully the culture that had produced the fleet, standing between my people and destruction. I asked her, during one of our longer conversations, about the decision-making process that had led her fleet to our system so quickly. I told her I still struggled to understand how a decision of that magnitude, committing an entire battle fleet to defend a system with no formal alliance, no treaty, no political relationship whatsoever, could be made without months of deliberation. She told me something that has stayed with me ever since, something I have thought about many times in the months that followed. She said that her people had a long history of being told, by others more established and more powerful, that they were not ready, not qualified, not sufficiently civilized to participate in the wider affairs of those who considered themselves more advanced. She said this exclusion had taught them something important, though not something anyone had intended to teach them at all. It had taught them to trust their own judgment rather than waiting for permission from institutions that had never valued them in the first place. I thought about the council in that moment, about the careful, endless deliberations that had ultimately produced nothing but abandonment when we needed help the most. I thought about how an entire species had been kept outside the circle of galactic cooperation specifically because they were considered unpredictable, and how that very unpredictability, that willingness to act without waiting for institutional approval, had ultimately proven to be exactly what saved my people when every properly established ally had already turned away. Word of the battle spread quickly once the immediate crisis had passed, and I watched, with a mixture of disbelief and quiet anger, as the wider galactic community began reacting to what had happened in our system. The Council, which had abandoned us without a second thought only weeks earlier, suddenly found itself scrambling to re-establish contact, sending formal diplomatic messages that praised our resilience and expressed what they called deep relief at our survival, as though their own decision to withdraw every Allied fleet had played no role whatsoever in the crisis we had barely survived. I remember reading one particular transmission from a senior council official, a message so carefully worded, so thoroughly stripped of any actual accountability, that I found myself laughing out loud despite everything my people had just endured. The message praised the, and I remember this phrase specifically, remarkable intervention of an emerging independent power, language so deliberately vague that it managed to describe humanity's decisive rescue of an entire system without once acknowledging that this emerging independent power had never been formally invited into galactic society in the first place. I showed that message to Commander Whitfield during one of our meetings, curious to see her reaction. She read it carefully, her expression unreadable for a long moment, before she finally set it aside with something close to quiet amusement. She told me that this kind of response did not surprise her at all. She said institutions built around careful political calculation rarely admitted fault directly, preferring instead to quietly absorb whatever positive outcome had occurred while distancing themselves from whatever failures had made that outcome necessary in the first place. I asked her whether this bothered her, whether she felt any anger toward a council that seemed determined to rewrite the story of what had happened here into something more flattering to their own institutional pride. She told me, with a directness I had come to expect from her by that point, that she had not sent her fleet here for recognition from the Council, and that whatever story they chose to tell about this battle mattered far less to her than the simple fact that Ilvanar Prime still had a population living safely on its surface. I found myself deeply moved by that answer, more than I expected to be. I had spent my entire career operating within a system built almost entirely around careful political positioning, where every action was calculated for its diplomatic value as much as its practical effect. Here was someone who had risked everything, who had committed an entire fleet across unimaginable distances, and who genuinely did not care whether anyone beyond the people she had actually helped ever properly acknowledged what she had done. The Council eventually sent a formal delegation to our system, several weeks after the battle, arriving with the kind of ceremonial procession that would have felt appropriate before their abandonment, but now struck me as almost grotesque, given everything that had happened in between. I attended the formal proceedings because my position required it, watching Council representatives deliver carefully composed speeches about resilience, cooperation, and the strength of galactic unity. Speeches that conveniently avoided any direct mention of the 6 weeks, during which that same unity had completely abandoned my people to face annihilation alone. I watched Commander Whitfield sit through those same proceedings with a patience I found genuinely admirable, offering polite, measured responses whenever Council representatives directed questions toward her, never once raising the obvious contradiction between their current praise and their previous silence. When one particularly self-important delegate suggested that this battle demonstrated the value of, quote, maintaining open channels with emerging powers, implying that humanity's assistance somehow validated the Council's own diplomatic approach rather than exposing its complete failure, I saw a brief flicker of something sharp cross her expression before she simply nodded and let the comment pass without challenge. I asked her afterward, once the formal proceedings had ended, why she had chosen not to correct that particular delegate, given how obviously misleading his framing of events had been. She told me that arguing with people determined to protect their own narrative rarely accomplished anything productive, and that she would rather spend her limited time and attention on practical matters, like ensuring our defenses remained strong enough to deter any further aggression from the Drovnar ascendancy, than on winning arguments about credit and recognition that ultimately changed nothing for the people who actually needed protection. I have thought about that conversation many times since, about the quiet, practical wisdom in her refusal to engage with performances that offered nothing real. I had spent so much of my career believing that recognition, that proper acknowledgement through official channels, mattered as much as the actions themselves. Watching her calm indifference to the Council's attempts to reshape the story of what had happened taught me something I had never fully understood before: that the value of an action does not depend on whether the right institutions choose to properly credit it. In the months that followed, I watched something shift across the wider galactic community, a slow but unmistakable change in how humanity was discussed, referenced, and considered by species who had previously dismissed them without a second thought. The Council, whether out of genuine reflection or simple political calculation, began extending formal invitations for humanity to participate in broader galactic discussions, invitations that arrived decades later than they should have, and that Commander Whitfield's government, I later learned, considered with the same careful, independent judgment that had characterized every decision I had witnessed from them throughout this entire experience. I do not know, even now, exactly how that relationship between humanity and the wider galactic community will ultimately develop. I know that trust, once broken, rarely rebuilds quickly or completely, and I understand that humanity has every reason to approach any future cooperation with careful skepticism, given how thoroughly they were dismissed and excluded for so many years. What I do know, with absolute certainty, is what I witnessed with my own eyes during those desperate days when everything I loved stood on the edge of destruction. I watched a species that owed us nothing choose to risk everything, not because any treaty demanded it, not because any political calculation required it, but simply because they received a call for help and decided, without hesitation, that the answer was yes. I think about Commander Grace Whitfield often, about the calm, direct way she looked at me through that first transmission and told me that hearing people were dying was reason enough to act. I think about the crew of that crippled destroyer who chose to keep fighting rather than retreat, protecting others even as their own ship burned around them. I think about Nathan Cole's quiet explanation of why his people trusted decisive action over careful calculation, a lesson born from generations of having no one else to rely on but themselves. Ilvanar Prime still stands today, home to nearly 2 billion people who continue their lives largely unaware of how close they came to losing everything, and how completely a species the galaxy had spent decades dismissing had been the reason that world still exists at all. I make sure, whenever I have the opportunity, to tell this story properly, to make certain that the truth of what happened here is not quietly absorbed into some more comfortable version of events that flatters institutions who did nothing to earn that comfort. The galaxy abandoned us when we needed it most. I will never forget that, but I will also never forget that when everything else failed, when every treaty and alliance and careful diplomatic relationship proved worthless in the moment it actually mattered, it was human warships that arrived anyway, sent by people who had never been given a single reason to care about what happened to us at all. I do not know what the future holds for humanity's place within the wider galactic community, or whether the Council's belated invitations will ever be extended in good faith rather than convenient political necessity. I know only that the galaxy underestimated them for far too long, and that the cost of that underestimation was measured, at least in our small corner of known space, in the lives of everyone who would not be alive today if humanity had made the same calculated, careful, ultimately self-serving choice that every other power in this galaxy had already made before them. They chose differently, and because of that choice, I am still here to tell you this story at all.